Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel AWS DevOps Niche Level. So in this video, we are going to touch upon an interesting service in AWS, which is ECS, Elastic Container Service. So as part of the lab, we will see how do we host a website in ECS, and that too using the Fargate Launch type. We will touch upon the various launch types offered by the ECS, but this is the lab that we will do. So let us go into the video. First, we will talk about what are all the various container orchestration service providers. So we know Kubernetes, one of the very popular container orchestration service. Then we have Docker Swarm. Then we have ECS, the Elastic Container Service, typically offered by AWS, right? So this is a container management platform from AWS, which is what we are going to discuss today in detail. Then we have DCOS. Then these are all the other container management platforms. We have Container, Nomad, OpenShift, etc. Okay. So, but the popular ones are basically Kubernetes, ECS, and to some extent Docker Swarm as well. Now, what is ECS? So, ECS is a container orchestration tool from AWS. So, it is a highly scalable, high performance container management service that makes it easy to run, stop, and manage Docker containers on a cluster. Okay, so typically, if you want to manage your containers within your AWS environment, so we can go ahead and launch the cluster via this ECS service. So it integrates with entire AWS platform. So you can see that ECS integrates with multitude of AWS services. It integrates with application load balancer, auto scaling, the AWS batch service, Elastic Beanstalk, CloudFormation, CloudTrail, CloudWatch events, right? So if at all you want to get some notifications about your container performance, the container related events via CloudWatch, you can integrate ECS with CloudWatch as well. You can integrate the logs as well with CloudWatch logs, CloudWatch metrics. Then it also integrates with ECR, which is the Elastic Container Registry. The registry to store the images. Then it also integrates with the EC2 spot instances, IAM, NLB, parameter store, and VPC. Okay. So ECS has the ability to support clusters of any size. So during the creation of the cluster, we just need to provide the configuration based on our application workloads. Then it also can integrate with application load balancer, network load balancer at the container level. And typically, if at all you are going for a EC2 hosted model, so there are two types of hosted models, which we will discuss in the coming slides. So ECS agent typically will run on EC2 instances, which will be sending the heartbeat signals to the ECS cluster. Okay, so ideally the ECS cluster will monitor the Docker containers running on the EC2 instances via this ECS agent. Okay. Right. So now where are the containers hosted in ECS as well as EKS, the Elastic Kubernetes Service? There are two types how you can host your containers within your ECS. So the one model is called as the EC2 hosted, and the other one is called as the Fargate model. So what is the difference between EC2 hosted and Fargate model? So EC2 hosted, if at all the organization wants to have a complete control on the EC2 instances in which they are going to deploy their containers, then they can go for the EC2 hosted model. Here, the end-to-end responsibility of managing the EC2 instances which are running your containers, the application containers will be the responsibility of the organization themselves. Okay. And whenever they are going for a EC2 hosted model, they also have the option to typically go for either the reserved instances or the spot instances for a larger workload. So if the application workload is very, very large, it's going to be very, very large, then organization can go for either the reserved instances or the spot instances. Okay. So spot instances, we know that we are going to get it at a much cheaper price. So these are the other flexibilities the organization has if they want to go for a EC2 hosted model. So here the end-to-end responsibility of managing the EC2 instances running your application containers will be with the organization. So then we have the next type, which is the Fargate model. So what is the AWS Fargate? So this is another popular launch type provided by the ECS service. So Fargate is a serverless pay-as-you-go compute engine that lets you focus on building applications without managing the servers. As I was mentioning before, in EC2 Hosted, the organization will have the responsibility to manage the servers in which their application containers are running. But if they're going for Fargate, it is a managed service. It's a serverless computing, just like the Lambda function or like a Elastic Beanstalk. I would say typically, Lambda function, where we don't have any exposure on the EC2 instances where Lambda is running, where the Lambda function is running, right? So similarly, it is a Fargate is a serverless pay-as-you-go compute engine and the end-to-end managed service. So this Fargate model is compatible with both ECS as well as EKS. Okay, and there is no management overhead of EC2 instances. So that is the main advantage with Fargate model. So if at all the organization wants to just focus on deploying their application via the containers, managing the containers, but not really want to focus on the EC2 instances that are running their containers, they can very well go for this Fargate model. Okay. Okay. So if the question is coming, in what scenario you will go for EC2 or in what scenario you will go for Fargate model, it ideally depends on your workload. So the differentiating factor will be typically on your workload. So if at all your workload is predictable and you are going to have some long running tasks, you can go for the EC2 hosted model, in which case the EC2 instances will be managed by the customer. And it will be a cheaper option as well, since as I was mentioning before, the customer will have the option to even select the spot instances that is available at a much cheaper price. Okay, but if at all the workload is application workload is going to be variable, wherein it is going to run some short running tasks, the workload is very ad hoc, and you can even expect some sudden spikes in traffic, then for those kind of workloads, the recommended launch type is a Fargate model. Okay, so in case of Fargate, there is no management that is required by the customer to manage their containers running on the EC2 instances and also the underlying EC2 instances. But this being a managed service, this is a costlier service when you compare it with the EC2 hosted model. Okay, so the primary factor based on which we need to decide whether it is going to be a EC2 hosted or Fargate is basically our application workload. Okay, so if at all you want to set up your application containers in ECS, so what are all the sequence of steps that we need to follow? So this is typically what we are going to follow in our lab demo as well. So what is the first step? We need to create a cluster in EKS. Then we need to create something called as the task definition. I will explain what do you mean by task definition. Then once the task definition is created, we need to run the task, which in turn is going to create the containers. Then in order to expose the containers to the outside world, if I want to consume that application, how do I do that? It is by creating the service. We will also see how to test the application. Okay, so these are all the sequence of steps that we will do as part of our ECS lab demo. First, we will create a cluster, then we will create a task definition, we will run the task, we will create the service, and then we will test the application. Now, what do you mean by your ECS task definition? So as part of creating your ECS task definition, we will define what is a launch type for your ECS, whether it should be a EC2 hosted or it should be a Fargate. That is what you define in the launch type. Then we also mention if at all a specific amount of CPU or memory that has to be allocated to your containers for the tasks which will be running your containers, that will be another configuration. Then we will mention what is the Docker image that will be used for your application container. It depends on the type of application that you want to run. So if at all you want to run a Nginx application, a Nginx web server, you will give the Nginx image. If at all you want to run a Tomcat application server, you will provide the Tomcat image. Or if you want to run a Apache HTTPD web server, then you will give the HTTPD image. Like that, based on the type of application that you want to run, you will be selecting the Docker image. Then we will also select the appropriate network mode based on which the containers will communicate with each other, right? So we have multiple network modes that is available. We have a bridge network, we have a host network, then we have the AWS VPC network, etc. So based on our use case, how we want the containers to communicate with each other, we will select the appropriate networking mode. But the preferred networking mode for ECS will be typically AWS VPC, because we need not really create any virtual networks. So whatever networks are available in VPC, so that will be taking care of the network connectivity between the containers. Okay, so networking mode is another important configuration we will provide part of the task definition. Then logging configuration. So if at all you want to integrate your the container related logs, the ECS logs, either to CloudWatch service or a CloudTrail service, then we will also define the logging configurations. Then if you want your containers to upload their data or to store their data in a kind of a persistent volume, then you typically define the data volumes for your containers. Okay. Then if there is some set of permissions that you want your task to use, we will define a IAM role and we will map that IAM role to your task. So ideally, these are all the 7 parameters that we will provide as part of our task definition, ECS task definition, right? So we will mention the launch type, whether it is EC2 or Fargate, and you also do a CPU or memory allocation for your containers. Then what is a Docker image that needs to be used with each container? What is the networking mode you want to use? The logging configurations. If you want to send your logs to CloudWatch or a CloudTrail, then specify the data volumes for your containers to persist the data, and also mention the IAM role that your task would use. Okay. Okay, so now let us get on to the lab demo, and we will see how do you launch your cluster in EKS and access the application. So let me go to the AWS console, and I will first search for ECS here, the Elastic Container Service, a highly reliable, secure and scalable way to run your containers in AWS. So our first step will be to create a cluster. I go to my slide here. First step is create a cluster in EKS. So I'm in my EKS dashboard. I just click create cluster, and cluster name, maybe I will say, yeah, this is my demo cluster. Okay, so this is the name of my cluster. And what is that? The hosting type that we need to select. As I was mentioning you, we have the EC2 hosted model, we have the Fargate model, and we can also use external instances using ECS anywhere. So I'm going to select this one, Fargate. It is a serverless model and the managed service. Okay, so let me just go ahead and directly create the cluster. So the cluster creation is in progress. So what is our next step? So we will have to create a task definition. So basically we will have to supply any of these parameters as part of the task definition configuration. Okay, so now our cluster has been created. So now what I will do, let me create a task definition. Okay, so you can see on the left hand side we have task definitions. So I click that, I will click create a new task definition. Okay, so what is a task definition family? So let's say I want to run my Nginx containers within the ECS cluster. So I'm going to give the name as Nginx task definition. Okay. Again, for the infrastructure requirements, I'm going to select the Fargate model. And this is what I was mentioning about the task size, right? The CPU memory, what you will be allocating to your containers. So by default here, it has taken one virtual CPU on 3 gigabytes of memory, assuming ours is going to be a very lightweight application. But if at all the application workload is going to be very high, you will have to select your appropriate task size. Okay, so also if at all you have any task role created, as I was mentioning, if you want to launch your tasks with some specific permissions, you create your IAM role and you can select it here. Okay, so in our case, I'm just going with the default. And what is the type of container that you want to run? This is a very important field for your configuration. Okay, here is what you will mention your image. For example, let me say I want to run an Nginx container. So here I will give the image for my container. Basically, the image from which the container will be created. So I will mention Nginx latest. So this is the image which will be downloaded from the Docker Hub. Okay, so whatever image that you specify, assuming you are not using any custom Docker registry, right? So by default, it will be downloaded from the Docker Hub. So I'll mention Nginx latest. I'll make it as an essential container, because if you select this as an essential container, other containers will depend on running of this container. Okay, so if at all this container stops, other containers are also going to stop. So that is your essential container. And let me define the container port here. It is going to be TCP. So protocol, I will leave it to, the container port is going to be 80. The protocol, I will leave it to TCP, right? And so our protocol, by default, I will leave it to HTTP. And again, here you can see the resource allocation limits in terms of CPU, the GPUs, memory hard limit and soft limits. I'm just going to leave it to the default. And this is what I was mentioning about that the log configurations. If at all you want to send the ECS logs to the CloudWatch service, or exporting the logs to the Splunk, or you want to export it to the Firehose via the Firelands, you have multiple options available here, right? So anyways, I'm going to disable this option. This is just for our lab demo. And if you see here, the container network settings. Okay, so this is what I was mentioning. Ideally, AWS VPC is the preferred network mode, but if at all you want to configure your custom network mode like the bridge network or a host network, you can go ahead with that as well. Okay, so I will leave it to the default AWS VPC. Then other options, I'm going to leave it as default, and let us go ahead and create this task. Okay, so our Nginx task definition has been successfully created. Now, what is our next step? So we are done with, let me go through the steps that we have completed. We are done with creating a cluster. We have created a task definition. Now we need to run the task. Whatever task definition we have created, let's go ahead and run the task. So this is our task definition. And you can see here, there is an option called run task. Let me click that. You can see that, task could be running now. Let me go ahead and check this. So this is our Nginx task definition. Okay. And yeah, you can see that the task has been already run here. So this is the container name, Nginx, and this is the image that it has used. Okay. So now basically our Nginx application is already running in the containers. So now how do we access that application? So that is the reason we have to create a service. So basically the main use of creating a service is to expose your applications to the outside world. Okay. So service exposes the application the outside world. How do you access the application running in the containers? It's via the service. Okay, so it's very important that you create the service. So now what I will do, let me go ahead and create the service here. So we have the task definition. I will go back to my cluster. Let me click the cluster. So you can see here, this is the tasks. Let me refresh the screen. Just double checking if the task has been created. Okay, so let me go ahead and create the service now. So let me click create service. Okay, so here the task is showing a 0. So it has not, it looks like the task was not created properly. So let me go ahead and run the new task again. And what is the task definition that I want to use? So this is the task definition I will use, Nginx task definition. So running the task is the one which is going to create the containers. Okay, and how many number of tasks you want to run? I'll just go with only one task. And networking mode, you can see here, if it is a AWS VPC, it is going to take the default VPC and it is going to distribute your containers across multiple availability zones. We need not worry about the availability part of it. Okay, you can see here now only the task is getting launched. Okay, so this is our task, and you can see that it is currently in the provisioning state. Okay, great. So now the task is running. So our next step is, let's go ahead and create the service. So as I was mentioning, service will help to access your application from the outside world. So let me click services here and I will click create. So capacity provider strategy. Okay, let me just leave that to default, and this capacity provider is Fargate, right? We have selected the Fargate model. And for what task definition you want to create the service. Okay, so basically creation of service here, it is going to expose your application via a EC2 instance. It is going to provide us a public IP address through which we will be able to access the Nginx application. So I will be giving a unique name for this service. I will mention Nginx service, and how many number of tasks you want to launch, number of containers, maybe I'll just say 1. And if at all you want to expose the service via the load balancer, if you have stood up a application or a network load balancer, you can select this load balancer option here. Otherwise, your service will be exposed, your application will be exposed via a EC2 instance with a public IP address. Okay, so now let me go ahead and create the service. You can see here the Nginx deployment is in progress. So ideally what it will do, it is going to deploy our containers or make it accessible via a EC2 instance, which will have a public IP address. Okay, so now we have done with all these tasks, creating a cluster, creating a task definition, then running the task, then creating the service. The final step is we need to test our application. So let us check if the service has been created. So you can view the status of your tasks and service under the cluster dashboard also. So this is our cluster, right? And you can see the service here. This is the Nginx service, what we created. You can see that the deployment is still in progress. And this is the task that we created, and we ran the task. Then this is the infrastructure that we selected, which is the Fargate model, right? And as part of the default CloudWatch monitoring, it is going to list you some the basic metrics that will be monitored. Okay, so now what we'll do is, let us select the service, and let me also go into the tasks. So I'll click this task. So if you see here, it has given a public IP address where your Nginx application is running. So if at all we want to access our Nginx application, we have to access it via this public IP address. So what I will do, I'm going to open this in a new tab. You can see here, so we are able to access our Nginx application that is running on the ECS cluster. And this we are able to do by creating a service, because creating a service only is creating, typically exposing your application via this EC2 instance public IP address. Okay. So if at all you have selected your application load balancer or a network load balancer, your application will be accessible via the load balancers. Okay. So I think this has given you some insight. How do you configure your cluster in EKS, how to host your applications in EKS via the Fargate Launch type. So typically, these are all the steps that we need to do. Okay, and access our application via the service, whatever we created. Okay, so if at all you want to do it for any other images, if you want to run a HTTP container or you want to run a Tomcat container, you can typically mention those appropriate image names in your task definition configuration. Okay. So the lab demo that we saw. Also, team, I am also offering training courses on AWS and DevOps. In fact, I had launched a separate video on what are all the various modules I'm covering as part of my AWS and DevOps training. And I also mentioned about the discussed about the course fee, etc. So if anyone would be interested to take up this AWS and DevOps trainings from me, you can feel free to send an email to this email ID, and I will be responding, with the details and also with the current batch, whatever is going on, when you can be part of the batch. Okay, but I would suggest you to, please watch my video that I have published before. You can actually click on the link above to access the video. And anyone interested, you can feel free to send a notification to this email ID. Okay, so this also I have explained in my video. The training mode will be via Zoom. Then the class recordings will be uploaded onto the Google Drive, and it is going to be taking 6 weeks minimum to focus on both AWS as well as DevOps. And the intent will be completely focusing on the hands-on lab exercise.